Welcome to the Renews podcast with me, Stephen Dunn.
Some of our assets have faced up to 30% dispatch down overall. That simply is not investable. You simply can't make an investment decision if you're concerned about that and if the studies and analysis that you're looking at are showing you that's going to be a problem.
I'm here with John Reilly, the head of renewable energy for B&M. John, you're very welcome to the Renews podcast.
Thanks, Stephen, and delighted to have you down at our almost new headquarters here in Newbury.
Pleasure to be here, and thanks for having me. I think one thing I was reflecting on the drive over was we're a few weeks after the decommissioning of Bellacorrick, Ireland's first commercial scale wind farm. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about that operation and also what it signifies in relation to B&M's renewable journey and also maybe the Irish onshore wind picture.
Yeah, so I mean, you're absolutely right and correct, Stephen. The Bellacorrick wind farm, which was a 21 turbine, 7 megawatt monster back in the day, in when it was commissioned in 1992. And in fairness to the guys and gals that have looked after that wind farm over the years, and they really have, particularly in the last decade, they treated it like their children and looked after it and managed it. And we managed to keep it operational in a safe manner for 33 years, which is quite remarkable. From B&M's perspective, I think what it did was it allowed the organisation back then to get a feel and a sense for this great resource that we knew we had in wind, that others around the globe were beginning to turn into an industrial application that could assist in producing electricity and helping with indigenous supply of electricity. The company got an opportunity to have a look at what that might look like on the big strategic advantage that we have in B&M, and that is our land bank. We own 80,000 hectares of land located across the countryside. And, you know, over the years, the company has learned how to do large renewable energy infrastructure at scale on that land bank. And that is what has allowed B&M to transition from a fossil fuel company to a company that today, every megawatt hour we generate at the moment from our gigawatt or so of operating assets is renewable. It helped the company to understand how that could be done commercially.
Continuing that story on in the area now, you're clearing the Bellacorrick site for around 100 megawatts,
give or take,
Onshore 3, which comes after similar sized 1 and 2. It's been a very complex and long running saga, shall we say. I mean, I remember reporting on it when I first started writing about renewables 15 years ago.
Yeah.
Perhaps you could sort of tell us about that complex and also what that scale means for Irish renewables in general and the story of Onshore and Bellacorrick.
Going back to the original reason why the wind farm was sited in County Mayo, it's one of the windiest places on earth, the west coast of Ireland, not Mayo in particular, but the western seaboard in Ireland along with the western seaboard in Scotland, onshore, never mind offshore, has incredible wind speeds, averaging typically at 10 metres a second. You know, the reality is that with large turbines like we currently have in phases 1 and phase 2 of Onshore, we're getting capacity factors that they don't get in the North Sea. So it was easy to see why my colleagues back in the day chased after a major wind farm when technology began to get to the point, Stephen, where you could do something at very significant scale. The original plan was to develop a 300 megawatt wind farm on that site, and planning was secured to do that back in the early noughties. That planning eventually expired because back in the day, we were chasing the wind, which was the right thing to do probably commercially, but we very soon realised that unless you have the grid capacity, you've got a problem. And again, that may seem so obvious now, but back in the day it probably wasn't. And it has taken the guts of 25 years to ultimately get the grid capacity available adjacent to the site to allow us to ultimately connect to 300 megawatts. It's not just about getting the power as we know out of Mayo, it's getting the power across the country. There's an amazing statistic I saw recently that 50% of electricity demand annually is consumed in that outer M50 rim, if you want to call it, from Arklow in the south to Portlaoise and around to Drogheda. So you've got to get that power across the countryside, and it's not just about getting it onto the local network and getting out of the area. It's about getting it across the country. And that has proved a real difficulty. And it's the reason why we built the wind farm in 3 phases. We will deliver phase 3 as another 100 megawatts or so on the back of additional grid capacity. So what's opened that up is the North Connacht reinforcement and the delivery of that upgrade in that northwest region that will help power flows.
Owenini and the development of the complex over 25 years, as you say, John, came at a time when the wider Irish wind industry went from Bellacarrick to 5 gigawatts today. And that's been a very successful expansion of a renewables industry, particularly in the years leading up to the 2020s. But right now, we're seeing in the last couple of years very low-level additions to the grid from wind every year. I think in the order of 50 megawatts possibly the last 2 years. In fact, I think we're going backwards on our 40%
Absolutely.
RESI target. What's happened, and is what's happened to Owenini in some way reflective of where we're at right now?
I think you can tell the story of the evolution of the Owenini complex. I think you're right, it does reflect probably the evolution generally of the onshore wind sector in Ireland. The planning challenges around that public acceptability issue and new technology, they were very significant. And in the first 10 years, I think, of onshore wind development, that was a major challenge. It really was. I think today, the public acceptability of onshore wind in particular is in a different place. We went through a period in Owenini where the original planning permission for the original facility expired before we could get moving because of the second issue, which was the grid capacity issue. And being able to secure grid capacity, grid expansion, network expansion to allow that scale of a facility to connect. And I suppose the last 10 years in the renewable sector and the slowdown in the most recent decade, certainly as you've said since 2020, has as much to do with lack of available, operable grid capacity, if that's a word, as it has to do with challenges on the planning side. Infrastructure development is not an easy game. It's not an easy game in Ireland. It's not an easy game anywhere. From the grid's perspective, we had a plan to deliver a grid that was fit for where we wanted to be in 2025. It was called Grid 25. And for a whole variety of reasons that we'd have to do a completely separate podcast on, Stephen, that didn't happen. And the reality is that if that plan had been delivered, if that level of infrastructure, there were 4 major 400 kV network expansions outlined in that plan, and then a number of other smaller but very strategic expansions of the high voltage network. If that plan had been delivered, Stephen, we'd be in a very, very different place today from an electricity security supply perspective. When you look at EirGrid's generation adequacy report that was published in the last few days, it again, it highlights the issue and the problem we have here. What I'm encouraged about and what we're encouraged about in B&M is the fact that this infrastructure problem is now recognised as an issue. And there is a real movement and attempt to fix it. And we believe it will be fixed. We will get there. The real challenge though, Stephen, is particularly around infrastructure like the grid, is the amount of time that it's going to take to deliver that. I've often said, I've been quoted recently as saying, let's take the Grid 25 plan, stick a sticker on it and call it Grid 35 and get on and deliver it.
In the interim period, we hear regularly in every market in Europe about grid challenges. It's never really explained what that means. Could you explain, John, for our listeners, as a developer of a large-scale renewable generation asset, what are the issues you're encountering or your peers in the market are encountering when it comes to getting grid connections?
It comes back to the simple fact that if you think about it, if you think about the government's plan to meet electricity demand, to maintain security of electricity supply, which is, it's the lifeblood of any economy, particularly today we're electrifying everything. And the state's plan for the transition from where we were and to meet that demand growth was to move from a system that had 12 or 13 gigawatts of generation capacity sitting on a network to a system that had, by 2030, almost 30 gigawatts of capacity sitting on the same network. So there is a problem here of simple size. The network simply isn't big enough. It's a bit like I always like to consider the high voltage power network in particular like the motorway network. And I'm old enough to remember travelling from Cork to Dublin after the jazz festival, when you'd be coming back up the road and it'd take you 24 hours to drive up, and crawling through Abbeyleix and crawling through Kildare and Monasterevin. And then the motorway network was built. And it was difficult. It had planning challenges, it had public opposition challenges. Remember, the completion of the M50 was held up for years by the Carrick Mines issue, but it eventually got done. And if you think of the benefit that the motorway network has delivered to this economy and the citizens of this state, I don't think there's anybody who wouldn't tell you that they are benefiting and have benefited from the motorway network. And that's because, why do we have to expand the motorway network? Because the level of ownership of private cars, public transport, population growth, there were more people trying to use the same road network. It's exactly the same thing now with electricity. There are more and more electrons trying to pile onto that system, and the system is just too small. So we need to expand it. The difficulty is the public acceptability of high voltage power lines has been a real issue and a real contentious issue. And let's be very honest about it. We as an industry, we as a sector, perhaps our government and our leaders, we haven't been clear enough about the need to do this. We really haven't. And it's no wonder then that the public perhaps get concerned about, who wants to live beside a high voltage power network, even though they're crisscrossed the entire country. So that's been a real problem, Stephen. It really has. The other piece that I have to keep reminding myself is, it's just a little over a decade since the IMF were in town. And I don't think there's anybody anywhere who could have foreseen in 2012 or 2013 the rate of recovery of the Irish economy and the rapid expansion of the Irish economy and the damage that financial crisis did to infrastructure development, to many, many parts of our economy. We're still living with the legacy of that. And what I mean by that is that financial crisis was brought about by a lack of control, a lack of governance. We were spending money willy-nilly. We were doing crazy things as a society, maybe as a country, as an economy. And then the House of Cards collapsed. And what we've replaced that with now, of course, is governance that in so many ways has swung completely the other direction. So governance and control and risk appetite that has swung completely the other direction. So delivering big infrastructure has suffered as a result of that. The capability and capacity, the level of technical and engineering people that left this country in the aftermath of the financial crisis a decade ago is a real problem right now.
You are listening to the ReNews podcast. For breaking news or to access our exclusive market intelligence on the global renewables sector, subscribe at renews.biz. Now, back to the show. I thought as a developer that they had solved the issue with ECP by bringing in regular grid processing rounds, offering, from what was this, a period of several years, I can't remember exactly how long, where you couldn't actually get any grid connection, where now it's a twice annual thing where you can apply for grid connections once you're consented. So I thought they had solved the grid problem.
Sure. So they've solved the problem of physical connection. So if you take Onany Phase 3, for example, we delayed the final 300 megawatts of the development up in Onany because of the ability of the local network to carry the power and take the power, not just out of that area, but out of the region. So we could physically connect the asset, and you're right, we could apply for a connection offer, we could get in and we could build that on a contestable basis and connect the wind farm. But what we have to be looking at is how that wind farm will operate in that grid. And the associated transmission reinforcements, that the things that have to be done to the wider network to allow that additional power to flow and operate in a way that will allow you to get your return on your investment, to operate efficiently, effectively. We have to consider that as well. And that's what the real issue is. So when we come to look at connecting a wind farm or a solar farm or even a thermal power station today, we do these very detailed power flow studies, Stephen, that looks at how injecting that amount of power into the network at that point, how will that operate? How will that manifest? And of course, what we're seeing today is real problems with constraint. And that's where these assets capable of generating 100 megawatts, the power system just can't take that. And we're seeing, though in some instances, some of our assets, depending on what's going on, have faced up to 30% dispatch down overall. That's constraint and containment. That simply is not investable. You simply can't make an investment decision if you're concerned about that, and if the studies and analysis that you're looking at are showing you that's going to be a problem. So that's why we could physically connect Onshore Phase 3 5 years ago, no problem at all, but it wouldn't have operated efficiently. We wouldn't have got the return back on our investment. Onshore Phase 3, Stephen, is going to be a 200 million investment. And our job is, we're a commercial semi-state company. We don't receive any money from the state. We raise all our finances on the international capital markets. So when we go to the banks and the lenders, they look at power flow studies, they look at how these things will operate. We model them. And that's the big problem right now.
And is this the reason why the last couple of years we've seen very few projects reach FID and enter construction?
100%.
Is this the sole reason?
I would say it's the main reason, Stephen. I would say there's a lot of our peers in the industry who have high quality projects that they've brought to FID, they've brought to that critical financial investment decision. And one of the things that's stopping them from ultimately getting clearance and getting investment and getting approval internally is the operability of those assets on a power system that today is just choked. That's the simple fact. So I know of a number of projects, of our projects that we've had to just sit. And Onshore Phase 3 is a good example, that we just simply couldn't have connected it until the North Connacht reinforcement, which actually is happening quite a distance away from the physical connection, but it's like a motorway bypass down the road. It's like the Adair bypass, Steve. It's not happening beside me in Kildare, but when I jump on the motorway in Kildare, I know that I can get to the beautiful town of Killarney and beautiful county of Kerry, where my mother was from, to see the relatives. I know I can get there a lot quicker. The analogy is exactly the same. And it's amazing. Sometimes when you get a grid connection, now they're quite complex documents. You look at the list of associated transmission reinforcements that need to be done to allow your asset to receive this firm status. And that's the status whereby the power system operator is saying, it's 100 megawatts you have, you'll be able to inject that 100 megawatts, broadly speaking, all the time into that network. Sometimes some of those associated transmission reinforcements can be hundreds of kilometres away from where you're doing. And I'll highlight one that sits on a lot of current grid connection offers in many, many parts of particularly the Midland region, the North-South interconnector. The absence of that motorway that's been planned for over 20 years is causing a real problem in the operation of assets across the Midland and I suppose the Eastern Seaboard region, because that motorway would take power and would help power. You could lift power from the smaller local 220, 110 kV networks and lift them and get them moving, bypassing the national roads or the local roads, and it hasn't happened. And that is the failure to deliver pieces of infrastructure like that are what has caused us to see, in my view, it's the principal reason why the rate of connections, the rate of delivery of operating assets has slowed to a trickle.
And yet, as you say, Grid 25 was spiked. Let's put a new sticker on it, make it Grid 35. EirGrid is coming up with more plans for large-scale grid infrastructure over the next decade. Mm-hmm. But in the immediate period, we're not going to see really any significant change to the grid in the next 5, 6, 7 years. So we have 2030 targets, we have 2035 targets. We're at 5 gigawatts today. The target is for 9 gigawatts by the end of the decade. On the last few years, we're nowhere near the pace of renewable power generation. Even from a security of supply situation, we're in trouble in the coming years, as EirGrid mapped out, I think, in their study over the last few days. Yeah. Where do we go from here? Do we go to a situation where we stop building generation and get the grid right, or do we need to come up with some sort of and look, you've asked the right question because
what we've said is it's great that as a society, as a sector, it has been accepted now that the grid is a real problem. And in fairness to government, they are backing the network owners and network operators to get after expansion of the network as quickly as they can physically do it. That won't happen overnight. However, there are some small but strategic maybe projects that can be delivered, network projects that can be delivered reasonably quickly, that in certain regions and in certain areas can improve things dramatically. You're not going to deliver, the north-south interconnector, the north-south tie line as we call it. It'll take a number of years to deliver. If they go back to looking at Grid West or GridLink, the expansion of the 400 kV network backbone is going to take time to deliver. In the meantime, though, there are some small, very critical grid infrastructure projects that could alleviate significant constraint in particular areas. And I think getting after those and getting those done as quickly as possible with the help of developers, I think what you've outlined before, the contestable build process, I think we have to push that increasingly to perhaps get developers, when they are constructing generation assets and doing grid, to do a little bit more under the system operator preferred connection methodology to help progress that and speed up that, deliver more infrastructure than their project requires, and they get reimbursed for the additional cost that comes with that. There are things like that are being looked at. The other thing I think is in the operation of the network. Now this is always a tricky one, because the operational standards of the network today, Ireland has one of the most reliable electric power systems anywhere in the world. And let's give credit where credit is due to ESB networks and EirGrid. The loss of load that we face as customers on the electric power system. I remember when I was a young boy, sadly, Stephen, back in the 70s, doing my homework by candlelight. And it was quite a frequent event. At the time, I think I don't recall it completely, but there was a lot of strikes. The ESB unions were obviously very powerful. And every second week, and there used to be notices in the paper about when your particular part of the network would be out. And that was life for us in the 70s and the early 80s. But in fairness to the network operators, the reliability of our electric power system over the last 25, 30 years has been top class, absolutely superb. And one of the reasons for that is what we call the system operation rules, the safety standards, the N-1 rule, very, very complex technical things. We're very, very cautious, in my view, about how we operate the network. And I think there are examples in other jurisdictions in Europe where you can lighten the rule set a little bit. And yes, maybe it does mean that the reliability of your power system overall declines by a modest amount, but it means we could get more power onto the network and operate the network more efficiently, temporarily, as we get this infrastructure build done over the next decade.
Do you get the impression that EirGrid, ESB networks and the government are moving in the right direction on this, and that they're receptive to such requests for more flexibility and taking maybe more risks and trying to push infrastructure through quickly?
I genuinely believe that we're at a point, because we have to be, Stephen, where that is happening. But some of those decisions, particularly around how you operate the grid, are not easy to take. So for example, what happened in Spain 12 months ago is not helpful at all. And it doesn't really matter why that happened. I firmly believe, based on my knowledge of what happened, that event couldn't actually happen on the Irish power system because of some of the controls we have in place, because of the form and nature of our power system. And there may be others who would say, oh, it could. But when stuff like that happens, Stephen, you can imagine somebody who might be looking at changing the existing rule set, maybe this risk appetite piece that we all talk about, leaning in a little bit more, taking a little bit more of a risk around how you operate the network, not from a safety perspective, but just from an operability perspective. That becomes a lot more difficult when you wake up the morning after the Spanish. The grid was out for 12 hours and it caused absolute chaos, as we all know. So I genuinely do believe that in the corridors of power, in the right places, these discussions are being had, and they need to be had. And I think we do need to be brave here. We do need to lean in a little bit. The other thing that will help is the large energy users policy, right? The rate of growth in electricity demand on the Irish power system it's running at 4 to 5% per annum. It's unprecedented globally. Imagine across the rest of the European continent, Stephen. electricity demand growth has been effectively flat for the last 5 or 6 years. In Ireland, it's doing that. Listeners can't see that, but it's growing at an incredible rate, scary rate. So how you manage things in that regard, and we know we've had an effective moratorium on the connection of large energy users across the country, and the government has produced a large energy users connection policy. And the critical element of that policy, Stephen, is getting the large energy consumer to come out and meet the generation. And that would be extremely helpful. So, for example, if we could see an increase in demand in Mayo, all of a sudden the opportunity to operate the assets that are up there more efficiently and perhaps put another 100 megawatts in the Mayo complex becomes a reality. Because we no longer have to get all of that power out of the site and down to the county boundary and out of Connacht and across the Shannon and down to that zone that I said at the moment, the outer M50 rim, as I call it, where 50% of electricity demand is today. If we move some of the large energy users regionally and geographically, it would help immensely in terms of power flows. It really, really would. And again, going back to what I said about some small strategic projects, so expanding the existing 400 kV network that's there and utilising that more efficiently. And there are 2 projects planned at the moment to do that, where you could suddenly lift power that's congested in the Midland region up onto that 400 kV network and push it into that zone much quicker. So there genuinely are things that could be done. And I think, in fairness to government, the state's policy around demand and large energy users in particular. And then the final piece of the jigsaw that we need to get after, and we're not really getting after, is flexible demand. When I go back to my early years in the industry and reading the reports, from the many reports about the role that renewables could play in helping the climate challenge, as it was at the time, and that we were moving effectively in this part of the world to a windy, gassy future. And, we'd have wind, and solar wasn't even talked about at the time. It was mainly wind, now solar, weather-dependent, intermittent, variable forms of generation backed up by flexible gas-fired capacity. And that's where we've landed, Stephen. And that work was done. The All-Island Grid Study was an epic piece of work that was done 15 years ago, an epic piece of work. And it explained how all this stuff could work. But a crucial element of it was talked about flexible demand. Now, in reality, from my perspective, we haven't really made massive strides in the flexibility of demand. We haven't really. And I don't know whether this will be acceptable. I was at an event last night where I was talking to somebody who's operating in that space. If you as a householder were told that you could get a 25% reduction on your annual electricity bill, for example, and where the network operator, when they had to, they just opened the breaker and shut you off, right? You might look at it and go, no chance. But maybe if you had a battery, a power wall, and you had solar panels on your roof, and now all of a sudden you can manage your own demand domestically for a few hours. That level of flexibility is a very simple example. Could be massive to helping power flows across the network and using generation capacity and new generation capacity more efficiently. And if you scale that up then to John Reilly's, not just John or Stephen's house, but maybe to an industrial installation or a small manufacturing company, and there's a lot of good work being done there with technology. And if you sign up to those things, the reality is you might not see an awful lot of disruption to your power supply, but it provides the flexibility to the network operators to manage power flows more efficiently. And it's a part of the jigsaw for me that in this new world of intermittent and weather-dependent renewables, we simply haven't got after, and we need to. So from an Ireland Inc. perspective, and what a brilliant testbed, a small, electrically isolated power system dominated by intermittent renewables. If we could show the world how demand-side flexibility could work, particularly at the large energy users level, that could become a blueprint for where the world wants to go.
As you say, there's a few different pieces of the jigsaw, and I think the jigsaw, it might take some time to finish it.
It will, but it's what we do on the way. We can't just sit today and say, look, we'll wait 10 years for the motorways to come. We can't.
So to finish on that point then, how, as a developer of large-scale wind, will you get projects built over the next few years what is the business case situation for wind in Ireland, and will we deliver on our 9 gigawatt 2030 targets?
Well, I'd start with that first of all, Stephen. I got myself into trouble a few years ago for doing a piece in the Sunday Business Post where I said there was no chance of that happening because, in fairness, when they were announced, the targets in the late teens, 2018, 2019, and Wind Energy Ireland did an excellent piece of work, and I would have been involved, we were involved in that, to say these are the pieces of the jigsaw we need to put in place to ensure we can do that. They haven't happened. That's the reality. Most of them haven't happened. So, in very simple terms, I think even the Minister recently has stated, let's be realistic about it, we're not going to hit that 9 gigawatt onshore target by 2030. What we need to be focused on now, though, is how quickly in the 2030s can we get that 9 gigawatt target and the 5 or 6 gigawatts of offshore. And I think we as developers, a consortium of developers and large energy users in particular can really come together here and help deliver elements, some of those strategic projects that I'm talking about that could unlock significant expansion of generation capacity in a relatively short period of time until that wider motorway network expansion comes. And I truly believe that the building blocks for that are coming into play. And I have to say this, we've had a lot of engagement with the tech sector. And we use that word large energy users. Large energy users are not just data centres. You know, large energy users are, the tech sector is right there for sure. And it's such an important part of our economy. It really is. Digitalisation is so important to us as a state and as a country. But it's also the pharmachem sector. It's also agri-food production. Many of these facilities, Stephen, are quite large in terms of their electrical load, and they're going to grow on the basis of some of the decarbonisation projects that they are doing internally. How that I suppose that the conflation of the demand customer, the generator, and the network operator can do stuff in the next decade. If we work together, and I say this particularly about the tech sector, 3 or 4 years ago when we began to engage with the tech sector and we talked about flexible loads, they said, no way, can't happen. And what the tech sector has figured out globally, Stephen, not just in Ireland, globally, is they need to become part of the solution. Because the world as it sits today, the global electric power system as it sits today, Stephen, can't meet the need of the tech sector over the next decade. And what I'm seeing is, and what we're seeing in B&M, is the tech sector beginning to understand they don't have an energy challenge, they have an infrastructure challenge. The energy's there, but it's how we work together to harness that. And I think what you're going to see increasingly, and the large energy user policy defines how that might work. The things that a large customer, has to do to help get their connection quickly and make sure that their connection can operate efficiently and that the overall power system can operate efficiently, not just for the large customer, but for all the citizens of the state, all the customers of the electric power system. And I actually think that the large energy users policy, it's not perfect, no policy ever is, but it's pretty good. And what we're hearing from large customers is this, if it's done properly, could become a blueprint for how large customers, and the tech sector in particular, is managed and is dealt with globally. Now, what an opportunity for Ireland Inc. to step right into that space and show leadership on a small, isolated electric power system in terms of how these big demands can be met. And remember, I finished by saying, we as society are demanding that big demand. We as society are moving to on-demand television. You know, we carry our mobile phones around, Stephen. That's more powerful than the first little computer I played with when I was in college way back in the day. And we're all walking around with these things in our pocket. So if you're a person that uses your mobile phone to find out where you're going every day, to watch stuff on, I have a penchant for backing horses, Stephen, as you know, and I do that on my phone. Like, all of those activities are managed in the cloud, Stephen. So it's not the big tech companies. The big tech companies are only servicing a demand that's there from us as citizens and customers. So we all have to work together to figure out how we can do that, because the alternative is we put away the phone and we go back to maps, or me walking into the local bookies. And that's not a place we probably want to go.
Well, on that note, John, we'll leave it there. Thanks very much for your time, and I look forward to a few tips in the future.
Thanks, Stephen.
Thanks,
you very
John.
much.
The Renews podcast was produced and edited by me, Stephen Dunn. Click subscribe wherever you get your podcasts to make sure you never miss an episode. For more exclusive market intelligence on the renewable sector, see renews.biz.